Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the 7th session of the Atlantic International Research or AIR Center's Networking Fridays. I know some of you have already participated in the past Networking Fridays, and I'd like to thank you for joining us again. And for those of you who are with us for the first time, our thanks to you as well for joining us, and a very warm and sincere welcome. My name is Wendy Watson Wright, and I'm very honored to have been asked to moderate today's session. My background includes having been the Assistant Deputy Minister of Science for Fisheries and Oceans Canada for 8 years. I'm the former Executive Secretary and Assistant Director General of UNESCO's Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, or IOC. And more recently, I was the inaugural CEO of the Ocean Frontier Institute, which is an Atlantic Canada-based transnational interdisciplinary ocean research institute. And for the past 6 months, I have been, I should say 2 months, I've been happily living in beautiful Prince Edward Island on 7 Mile Bay, and that's in Canada's smallest province. Now, before introducing today's speaker, I would like to go through a few housekeeping items. First of all, the webinar will be recorded. Only the speaker and moderator will be on the video and able to speak audibly. And for participants, please make sure your name is used when you log in so we know who's asking a question. And for the questions, I would ask that you use the Q&A, not the chat. So the Q&A is for the questions. We do plan to stick to the 1 hour time limit. And so the plan is to end at 1400 hours UTC. So on with today's session. As I say, I'm honored to have been asked to moderate, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Sheila Heymans, who is the Executive Director of the European Marine Board, and whose presentation is entitled 25 Years of Enabling Marine Science in Europe. Now, I had the honor and pleasure in 2019, last year, of chairing the panel, which reviewed the performance of the EMB, and that review was very positive, I will say, in terms of the EMB's performance. And that was due in no small part to Sheila's dedicated leadership and the effective and professional work of the staff. So Sheila et al., well done again on that. Now, while we're on the subject of EMB, we were reminded yesterday by Dr. Uwe Jenisch of Kiel that these are also the initials of Elizabeth Mann-Borghese, the founder of the International Ocean Institute, who was also considered the First Lady of the Ocean, given her pivotal role in getting the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea off the ground. And I would encourage all of you to access the book of essays that was put together 2 years ago by IOI Canada as a tribute to her when she would have been 100 years old in 2018. The book is entitled The Future of Ocean Governance and Capacity Development. It's by Brill Publishing, and it's open access, so available to anyone who's interested. So back to our presenter. Besides being Executive Director of the European Marine Board, Sheila is also a professor in ecosystem modeling at the University of the Highlands and Islands in Scotland. She sits on the Modeling Workshop Steering Committee of the Global Seamounts Project, the External Advisory Board for Ember Sea, Blue Cloud, and Eurofleets Plus, and was a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES chapter, Policy Support Tools and Methodologies for Scenario Analysis and Modeling of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Sheila has 20 years or more of experience in the environmental impacts of fisheries and ecosystem change, and has published more than 70 peer-reviewed publications on these topics. So we are very fortunate indeed to have Sheila with us today. And Sheila, I would ask you to please take it away. Sheila.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Wendy. I forgot that you had all that information about me. I thought I was only going to be talking about the Marine Board, but now all of a sudden it turns out that people might want me to talk about modeling as well. But no, this is all about the European Marine Board. And I will say that this is 25 years. We're not officially celebrating 25 years because it's a little vague about when we were born. But I think it's a good time to look back at what we've achieved so far. And I will also say that I see Niall McDonough is actually one of the participants, and I think he's done an amazing job. I took over from him 2.5 years ago, and he's done an amazing job in getting the Marine Board where it is now. So moving ahead, what is the Marine Board? For those of you that don't know, the European Marine Board is a unique European partnership of major marine oceanographic institutes, that's the orange dots there, research funding agencies, the blue dots, and national networks of universities, which are the red dots. We've got 35 members from 18 countries. The board has got a secretariat, which is headed by myself, but Gilles Lerucra from Ifremer in France is actually our chair for the board. In the secretariat, we have 4 science officers, including Paula Keller, Tioka Koopman, Britt Alexander, and Uncle Muniz. And so between the 5 of us, with Gilles' leadership, we try to make sure that we produce the documents that you see that we'll be discussing here today. So what we do in general is that we transfer knowledge to the core of the marine research policy. That's kind of our aim, that's our vision. And we do that by providing advice to, sorry.
Sheila, can you please share your screen?
I am sharing my screen. Oh, am I not?
Oh,
Maybe I'm not.
I don't have it, but perhaps others.
No, I think you are right. I am not, in fact, sharing my screen. That was silly.
Thank you.
All good plans. Okay, I shall start again. Well, I won't start with all the spiel again, but anyway, I'll start at the beginning of the slides. Okay, so here we go. These are the, sorry about that, people. These are the, all of our members, as I was mentioning, and my secretariat there. So Paula, Joka, Britt, and Uncle are the members of the secretariat, and Gilles Lerucra from France is our chair. So okay, so what our vision is to transfer knowledge to the core of marine research policy, and we do that by providing position papers and vision documents, creating events like conferences and forums, and making some targeted interventions. And we're trying to influence research programming, research investment, and capacity building in general in Europe, but also at national level. So we're targeting not just the Commission, but also national policymakers and funders. So where did it all start? Well, it basically started in 1989 between the precursor to what is now the European Commission's DDRTD and the European Science Foundation, who established a European Commission for Oceans and Polar Sciences. This was chaired by Gottlieb Hempel from Germany, and basically they were this committee was charged to identify the grand challenges in oceans and polar science. So it was oceans and polar in one. And they came up, so they spent about 5 years working on this, came up with had a conference in 1994 and came up with a book that they published on the grand challenges for European cooperation. And they came up with 4 main challenges, including 2 operational forecasting of the oceans and coastal seas and the variability of the deep sea floor, and 2 that was more Arctic based, so the Arctic Ocean and the European program on ice coring in Antarctica. And then there was 2 other challenges that they thought was important, but it wasn't as important as the others, and those were coastal zones and biodiversity. So after they had this launch of this book in 1995, the European Science Foundation then set up the Marine and Polar Sciences Board. So basically, that's where the 25 years comes from, because we were a board for the past 25 years. And basically, we were asked to coordinate, they were asked to coordinate specific marine and polar joint activities. And they had member organizations from the Science Foundation's National and Marine Polar Science Institutes. And so that was great. They brought out this book, and as in typical science fashion, the very first thing that came out was an article in New Scientist on the 30th of March in 1996 to ask whose research is this anyway, and complaining about the fact that this book is assuming that there's been no cooperation at all in Europe. And the ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea and some of the technical committees at the Commission level has been cooperating for a long time. So if anybody's interested, it's quite an interesting article to read, and I think you'll get my slides afterwards so you can have a look at it. So after this, so after the 1995, the Marine Board was then, or the European Science Foundation then had an independent review of this board. And what's happened after this review is that it basically split into the European Polar Board and the Marine Board. So then the Marine Board became a self-funded non-governmental body with 24 organizations from 16 countries, mainly marine science institutions and national funders. It also then had gotten a secretariat, and Niamh Connolly from Ireland was the first executive secretary, and the secretariat was actually based in Strasbourg in the first instance. So over time, sorry, my nose is itchy. Over time, the Secretariat has the Executive Secretary changed to Niall McDonough, who, hello Niall, I see you're on the list. He became the Executive Secretary in 2007, and then the Executive Director in some time between 2007 and 2017, when he left to go back to Ireland, and I took over in 2018. So at the moment, and in 2007, the Secretariat moved to Ostend because Bliz is still very graciously supporting us to have the Secretariat here at the Flemish Research Institute in Belgium. So at the moment, the 5 of us in the Secretariat, which is in the picture you see at the bottom, is also, we also have some young ambassadors that are supporting the work of the Marine Board, and those are, so they have 2-year terms. The first 2, Liam Lachs and Alba Gonzalez, were appointed last year, so from 2019 to this year. And then we've got 2 new young ambassadors, and Natalia Dunik and Alessandro Cresci, who we were hopeful that we would be able to meet with them and actually sort of get them into the swing of things in March. But unfortunately, Corona happened, and so we had to have our meeting online, as you can see from the picture there. So that's kind of a little bit about the Secretariat, but it's not really what it's about. It's more about science. So what also happened is that the Marine Board changed its name in 2013 from the Marine Board to the European Marine Board. Doesn't really matter, but it happened, and then we also expanded in at that time to have not just national research organizations and funders, but also consortia of universities that do a lot of marine science. So we've expanded our membership. In 2016, we became our own legal entity, IVZW, it's called in Belgium, with the 8 founding members, which you can see on the map here. And then in 2017, became fully independent from the European Science Foundation, and we are now a fully self-sustaining independent organization. So that's a little bit about the background. Let's get back to the science, because that's much more interesting. So as I said, in 1989, we had this committee that was set up, the European Committee for Ocean and Polar Sciences, which was chaired by Gottlieb Hempel. But what was interesting when I looked into this is that actually it had 2 biologists, 4 research administrators, 4 physical oceanographers, and 6 geologists, which, to be honest, is a very strange makeup for a working group or for a committee. I was quite surprised by that. Maybe it's because it's 25 years later. And what happened after that very first document that they wrote is that they also started looking at writing position papers. So what we do is we try and look at what is the state of the art of science, and we do that through writing position papers. And not surprising, with 6 geologists in the list of on the committee, they obviously started working very quickly on geology. So the very first position paper was on the deep sea coring and drilling in Europe, and where they were identifying drilling capabilities, long-term science strategy, and promoting European technologies, which is great. The way these working groups usually happen is that they have some meetings. So you can see that there were 2 meetings in Strasbourg and Southampton, and then the document is written. So that was great, and it actually was quite interesting for those geologists out there. But what then happened, as I said, is that the Marine Board split from the Polar Board, and I suspect what happened is that all the geologists went to the Polar Board, because after this document, we haven't actually done anything more on geology until we've now got a new geohazards working group, which just started in 2020. So very interesting that the makeup of these boards make a big difference to how what documents come out. So as I said, if I go back here, we only had 2 biologists in this initial committee, but I suspect that one of them was probably Carlo Hype, because the second position paper that we did was actually on a European science plan on marine biodiversity. So marine biodiversity became really important after the split between the Marine Board and the Polar Board. There was a few workshops at that time again, and after that, after the first position paper, they also wrote a document on establishing a framework for how do we implement marine biodiversity research in Europe. So marine biodiversity has been quite important for the Marine Board and for science in general in Europe. And that you can see actually on the right-hand side. We also had some Framework 6 programs like the Network of Excellence MARBEF, which happened from 2004 to 2008. But also internationally, there was the Census of Marine Life, there's OBIS and GBIF and GEO. So all of these things have biodiversity was very important in all of these cases. In addition, in the 2000s, the Convention for Biodiversity was set up, and it basically asked to support approaches for marine management, asked to facilitate the establishment of marine protected area networks by 2012, and maintain the productivity and biodiversity of important vulnerable marine ecosystems, including areas outside of national jurisdictions, so ABNJs, which is only now coming to fruition actually with the ABNJ discussions that are happening at the UN level. That convention was then revisited in 2010, and we got the ACHI targets out of that. And target 11 specifically asked then for that by 2020, we would have at least 10% of our coastal and marine areas that are important for biodiversity and ecosystem services be conserved, and that we have a system of protected areas. Well, to be honest, I don't think we're there yet, because we definitely didn't have by 2020 10% of our coastal and marine areas fully protected. Also in 2012, the International Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services was created, and so they've also been working in this area. So just based on these things that have been happening, that had been happening after those very first documents, there was then the document, our very first Future Science Brief, which was written by Carlo Hype and Niall in 2012, which was on a marine biodiversity, on the science roadmap for marine biodiversity in Europe. So that's a really interesting document that still has quite a lot of good recommendations, so we'll look at that in a moment. But also, we also worked on a position paper on advancing ecological coherent marine protected areas in Europe. So what are the science need and priorities for that? That was position paper 18 that came out in 2013. In addition to that, we've also looked at biodiversity in more specific areas. So position paper 17, for instance, was on marine microbial diversity. So looking at biodiversity in the microbial realm. And position paper 22 was also very heavily looking at biodiversity in the deep sea. So you can see that over time, biodiversity has always been part of our genetics at the Marine Board. Coming back to that roadmap, which I think still has something to give. Some of the recommendations that came out there was that we need a better understanding of the factors that generate and maintain and deplete biodiversity. And we need to be able to develop spatiotemporal scenarios looking at ecosystem and socioeconomic and climatic models. And both of those recommendations eventually came to fruition in the Future Science Brief on enhancing Europe's capability in marine ecosystem modeling, which came out in 2018. And not surprising, knowing my background now, I was actually the chair of that working group, which is how I came to be at the Marine Board in the first place. Some of the other recommendations are understanding the links between marine biodiversity and essential ecosystem services and creating effective value systems to account for the provisioning and loss of marine biodiversity. And that came out in our position paper, in our Future Science Brief 5 in last year, which is a document on valuing marine ecosystems. And again, that document is actually took a long time to come out, but we just heard this morning that it came out, it was mentioned and highlighted in the European Commission's Blue Economy 2020 document that's just come out. That's great, but I don't think we're there yet. I think the European Commission is working on this with the EU Biodiversity Strategy 2030, and the European Green Deal has got some, makes good strides on marine biodiversity, on biodiversity in general. But in general, we definitely haven't solved this problem. We still have papers like Marine heat waves threaten global biodiversity. And just last year, the IPBES brought out the Global Assessment Report. And just in one of their figures, you can see here, looking at the current global extinction risk for different species groups, the groups that has the highest gray bars here, which I've highlighted in purple, are the ones that are data deficient, and specifically crustaceans, sharks and rays, corals and bony fishes are the marine groups that really we have quite a lot of data deficiency. So data is really important, and we haven't really solved this problem. We haven't cracked that nut yet. So that's one part of that we've actually been pushing, for in the last 25 years. One of the other things that the Marine Board has been pushing on for a long time is starting off in 1995 with the grand challenges for European cooperation, is basically looking at creating a European marine research area. So that was something that research areas, European research areas, was something that was available in various other parts of research in Europe, but there was not really a marine research area at the time. So that was taken on then, and for instance, after at the Eurasian conference that happened in Hamburg in 2000, there was actually a document that came out towards the European Marine Research Area. Again, we were pushing for it in position paper number 3, Navigate the Future 1, which again was towards a Marine European Research Area. Our Navigate the Future series is basically the long-term look at what the science needs are. And so this was the very first one of those that came out. And obviously the Marine Research Area was very important. Again, position paper number 5 in 2002, talking about integrating marine science again. Then eventually, obviously, after all that pushing, there was a green paper that came out on the European Research Area that came out, and we made some responses to this green paper in position paper 11 in 2007. So you can see that from 1995 onwards, there was pushing to get this done. There was also some European projects under 6 framework funding. There was a project that ran from 2004 to 2009 called Marine Era, which was about facilitating cooperation. And then from 2010 to 2014, there was the Sea Eras project, which was the ERANET project under 7th framework funding. And the Seas Era project was really interesting because it pushed to get strategic research agendas for the different sea basins. So here it went from the marine research area in general for Europe to more basin scale research areas, which probably makes more sense from a marine science perspective. And so we have these strategic research agendas for the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Atlantic. So those research agendas, research and innovation agendas, then followed into projects for the Atlantic Ocean, the Aurora project, the Blue Med, and the Black Sea Connect. And I think actually Barnos, I missed out. Barnos was also one that followed into this field. And the Seas Era project also came up with some a legacy report where they made some recommendations, and these recommendations I think were quite interesting, and we took them up in our documents again. So there were some recommendations that we need to strengthen human capacity building, specifically for completion of PhD fellowships, which probably influenced the Erasmus programming, but also there was a recommendation to enhance public awareness towards marine and maritime scientific policy issues. So the strengthening human capacity building came out, we took it up and we had a working group on that came out with a future science brief on training the 21st century marine professional. And then the enhancing public awareness, There was a sea change project which looked at ocean literacy, but also we had a position paper and a policy brief on advancing citizen science. Again, one way to enhance public awareness. Just now, we're actually part of a project that's looking at ocean literacy called EU for Ocean. And so that's still pushing on that, making sure that we have public awareness. And then two other things that I think still pushes in this direction is the partnerships. There's now, the European Commission is working on partnerships, and specifically a partnership for marine, but also the mission. I think both of these two things will help with pushing the marine research areas in Europe. Then going on to something else that started quite early on in the Marine Board was a position paper on marine biotechnology. So there was a position paper number 4, which was basically looking at a feasibility study and a European strategy for marine biology, marine biotechnology. And it basically outlined research and development priorities and looked at dispersed infrastructures, asking that they should refocus these dispersed infrastructures and asking for directed funding to do this properly. We then revisited it in 2015 with a position paper that looked for a new vision for and strategy for Europe. And the vision was that by 2020, that's this year, that the European marine biotechnology sector should be organized, integrated, and globally competitive. Now, I'm not a marine biotechnologist, so I don't know, but it would be quite interesting to know from the marine technologists out there whether this is actually true. Is it a well-organized and integrated group? We also did some, we also run some European Marine Board forums. So the 3rd European Marine Board Forum was specifically on new technologies for a blue future. And that basically highlighted that we need innovation hotspots in Europe that can showcase emerging technologies, but also look at novel applications for human well-being. So that was the first time human well-being came into it. And again, the funding call for that happened in 2001 was eventually funded, came to fruition in FP7, so in the 7th framework, with a project called Marine Biotech. And Marine Biotech was a Sea Era project on biotechnology, obviously. And in this policy brief that we wrote with them, we basically looked at the strategy for marine biotechnology to 2030. This is not the end of it. Again, I see the Blue Bio co-fund has just come out with some information about that today. So biotechnology is still enhanced in that Blue Bio co-fund. So the other thing that I mentioned that came out in this forum on technologies for the blue future was the novel applications for human well-being. And it basically called for technology that should be driving bio-inspired breakthroughs, looking at bio-based polymers and multiple applications for marine and maritime sectors. Also looking at molecular techniques like molecular studies of sponges and looking at new opportunities for bioprospecting. And that basically came back in our position paper number 19 on linking oceans and human health. So this was something that came, sort of blew over from America really, and linking oceans and human health was something that was quite new in Europe. So after this position paper that we brought out, there was a funding call that came out in Horizons 2020 that funded a project, SOPHIE, Seas, Oceans and Public Health in Europe, which just finished in May. This project was coordinated by Laura Fleming from Exeter University. And in that project, the Marine Board helped write a strategic research agenda, which basically highlighted 3 different areas that was important for oceans and human health: sustainable seafood and healthy people, blue spaces, tourism and well-being, and marine biodiversity, biotechnology and medicine. And just this week, or last week actually, we brought out a policy brief that is basically highlights the policy needs for oceans and human health. So after the strategic research agenda priorities in 2013, we're now looking at what is the policy needs that we have. If anybody's interested in SOFI or in oceans and human health, then I would suggest that you watch the YouTube video that's at the bottom of the screen here, because we had an event on Monday in a virtual event, obviously, in the European Parliament, which basically gives a really good overview of that. Okay, so that's basically the biotechnology, and following on from that, one of the other things that Marine Board has been very good at influencing is maritime policy and governance. It started with Navigate Future 2, where we basically looked at integrating marine science in Europe, and where we called that Europe needs to move towards sound and true governance of its oceans, and it needs integrating the components of a comprehensive and responsible management of its marine assets. Again, in Navigate the Future 3, we called for it again, talking about the Galway Statement and the Green Paper on Maritime Policy, that specifically needs regional marine resource management, and asking for a forum for stakeholders, science policy, industry stakeholders, and for effective management and synergies between sectors. So that green paper that I was mentioning, we had a response to both the 2 green papers in our position paper number 11, and this was specifically looking at future maritime policy for the European Union, which we responded to. We also had more specific kind of calls for policy. So here is a vision document that was created in 2010 on marine renewable energy. And that basically called for a European policy on marine renewable energy, which we don't have yet. This is 10 years later, but policy seems to work really long, in a really long term. And it also calls for a governance framework that relies on sound research and asking for the development and consolidation of enabling policies and aligning competing policies. And I think that's something that in Europe we can really work towards still. Another sort of push for governance came out in Navigate Future 4. Again, Navigate Future series is really looking forwards to what is the research needs that we have. And in this document, it was quite a comprehensive document where we had 13 thematic chapters that basically came out with science policy briefing documents. And some of the chapters were on safe and sustainable use of marine space, sustainable harvesting of food, linking oceans and human health, having an integrated and sustained ocean observing system, and effective marine science policy interfaces. So you can see that we've been pushing for this for quite a while. So this was in 2013, and with all this pushing coming from the Marine Board, I guess we eventually made some waves, because luckily Commissioner Vella from DG Mare in 2016 called and asked for meetings with the directors. And so between 2016 and 2018, we had some, I think, 3 meetings with Commissioner Vella and his entourage and people from DG Mare. And we talked a lot about the different policy and governance needs. I specifically remember the mission coming up, Mission Ocean, and the sustainable observations was something that we talked about a lot. And I think one of the last things that Commissioner Vella still instituted was the EU International Ocean Governance Forum, which, if you're interested in that, you can go to the webpage there. So we're part of this project, and we are still pushing to get good governance and good policies. So this is a project under DG Mare that is running from last year to 2021. So that's basically pushing in ocean, in maritime policy and governance. Then I think one of the longest and most sustained pushes that we've done was basically on what I'm calling the observation value chain. So of course, as marine scientists, we really like doing observations. But you know, the question is what happens to those observations? And really, in order to make a difference, we really need to go from observations to management. So basically, this observation chain started with the Eurasian conference in Aberdeen in 2008, where Commissioner, well, it probably started before then, because the Marine Board had a panel on EMODNet, which is European Maritime Marine Observation and Data Network is what EMODNET stands for. And so this panel with the Eurasian Conference basically was pushing for this. And the Commissioner Joe Borg at the Eurasian Conference then asked for the support, asked that we should import the importance of long-term data series to ensure adequate baselines to facilitate assessment, modeling, and forecasting, and mentions that EMODNET is a really good way to do that. So over this time, the Marine Board had been working since that time, since 2000, late 2000s. And the Marine Board has been working with the network, the European Global Ocean Observing System Network, EuroGOOS, and we've been pushing to get sustained observations and a sustainable system. So this document on explaining what EMODNET is came out. We also, in our very first Marine Board Forum, looked at marine data challenges from observations to information. And again, in our second forum in 2010, we looked at the European Network for Marine Observation Observatories for Monitoring and Research. And in that forum, we basically had a vision that there should be a long-term, stable and integrated network of strategic marine observatories that should be funded under multinational cooperation, and we should provide consistent in situ data so that we can actually address integrated maritime policy needs. So it called for a European strategy to develop this network and to have innovative long-term funding to do that. It also mentions advances of e-infrastructure frameworks and quality control data sets. So this is, for those of you who know EMODNET and such, this is kind of the precursor of that. So obviously from that push in 2008, we've been working on this, and in 2014, EMODNET then became its own network that's been financed, or actually I think it was a project at first that was financed by DG Mare's European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, and is still funded under that funding call. But in this case, we also kept on pushing, not just because EMODNET becomes more about the information, but the sustainable observations is still something that we're pushing, and we're still pushing on this under the European Ocean Observing System. So under EOS, we're basically pushing to align and integrate and promote the ocean observing capacity of Europe and making sure that we have it sustainably funded. So with that and the steering group of EOS, we and EuroGOOS have worked on creating a strategy for EOS from 2018 to 2022 and an implementation plan. And in that implementation plan, one of the things that we had, as the Marine Board had promised to do, was to look at biological observations. So we have a future science brief on strengthening European capability in biological observations. And in addition, we've also been looking at big data. So our very newest future science brief that just came out even after the Corona lockdown is on big data and marine science. So that basically is all feeding into the sustainable observations and information, looking at that observation data stream. And still under the International Ocean Governance Forum, we are still continuing to push for this. This is still something that we're calling for. How do we make sure that our observations are sustainable? Another part of this observation value chain is remote sensing. So this is something that I just found out this morning, speaking to our previous chair, Jan Meers, that remote sensing was something that the chair of the Marine Board at that time was really interested in. So after the Mercia project, which was a FP7 funded project, and during that time they had some workshops, and they brought out a state-of-the-art and perspectives on remote sensing in shallow seas, position paper number 12 in 2008. That led on to two FP7 projects, My Ocean and My Ocean 2, and that was the precursor to Copernicus. Obviously, Copernicus is the state-of-the-art now, and any modeler out there knows that that's the best way to get data for drivers of your ecosystems, for instance. So in this position paper, it calls for a wider uptake of satellite ocean color data and asks for easy and unrestricted free access and free data products and online web-based products. So obviously EMODNET is doing that really well, but also the piloting Blue Cloud, the Blue Cloud initiative, the piloting project that's out there, will really push for that as well. Another part of the observation value chain that's very important is obviously research fleets. Obviously, in the oceans, it's really hard, well, maybe less so now, but it's still very important to have a research vessel to go and collect data. And the Marine Board, since from 1999 to 2005, had a panel on European research vessel operators panel called ERVO, which became an independent network after that. It brought out a position paper in 2007 on the common strategies and enhanced use of the European Ocean Research Fleet. And that really led to the Eurofleets and Eurofleets Plus projects, which has been very good at making sure that research vessels can work across nations. Then 10 years after this position paper, we were asked to revisit where is the research fleet now? Is it doing better? Is it doing worse? And so a new position paper came out last year on the current status and foreseeable evolution of the European research fleets. And then we also created a policy brief. So if anybody's interested but doesn't want to read a 150-page document, the policy brief then gives you a good overview of where we are. And basically the bottom line is that in the 10 years, the research fleet has gotten virtually 10 years older on average. So the research fleet is able to do what we need right now, but going forward, we're really going to have to make sure that we modernize and renew the vessels because 10 years from now, we'll be in real trouble. Then another part of this observation value chain is obviously modeling. You'll see here that this goes back to the early 2000s, and you might remember that we had 4 physical oceanographers in that very first committee. So I suspect that the 4 physical oceanographers was the reason that we have this position paper on hydrodynamic modeling that came out in 2005. And basically, this document asked for that we need a wide range of models, and we need an ensemble approach, and we need a systems approach, and we need to link these models to holistic simulators, it was called, i.e. what came out in the document in ecosystem modeling, which is basically saying that in order to model these ecosystems, you really need to link all the way back to the physics. So again, this is sort of something that's been quite interesting to see how this has evolved over time. But in the ecosystem modeling document, we still call for an ensemble approach and a systems approach, so that hasn't changed. Some of the other documents, especially the newer documents, have all called for more and better managed data. So I am not going to go into many of these. The ecosystem one I will talk about a little bit, but we had a document on chemical pollution, microbial diversity. There's a really interesting document on the land beneath the waves, sort of an archaeology thing, and the deep sea documents, and they all call for better data, more data and better managed data. So the observation value chain is what I'm calling it, is very important. Okay, so the ecosystem approach document, this was actually, remember the very first complaint about the fact that we forget that there's other networks? Well, here we actually worked with ICES and with EFARA, the European Fisheries and Aquaculture Research Organizations, I think they're called. And so here basically, this document looks at the science dimensions for the ecosystem approach, and it asks for some critical science priorities, including integrating policy evaluation tools, looking at how the ecological system supports provisioning services, looking at consequences of change, looking at advantage and limitations of conservation policies, and so forth. Again, data comes out here. So these calls for policy needs and evaluation tools and ecosystems approach came out in various documents. So the first one is on decommissioning of the offshore man-made structures, which was a policy brief we did in 2017. Obviously, modeling is in there, but also valuing marine ecosystems is a follow-on from this position paper on ecosystems approach. Then just a few things about human impacts. We've done a few different sort of specific things on human impacts. The first one is obviously the most important, climate change. In 2007, we looked at the impact of climate change on European marine and coastal environments. And that was followed by, synthesis of the European research effects of climate change. That was a special report of a FP7 project, Clamar. We've also done some small science commentaries, which are really kind of pithy articles, 1 or 2 pages. And those are in 2013 by Peter Hogan on getting ready for ice-free Arctic. And in 2017 on the ticking time bomb of climate change and sea level rise. We also looked at climate change in our 5th forum, where we specifically looked at the critical role of ocean science in responding to climate change. It basically led to a statement to the COP21. So there was an Ocean Climate Nexus document that was sent specifically to the COP21 from the Marine Board. So that's on climate change. Some of the other impacts that we've done is, I'll start with chemical pollution on the right-hand side, specifically looking at chemical pollution in the European seas, but also looking at noise pollution. So quite early on, we looked at noise pollution and specifically on marine mammals. And that document is actually we've just been asked to revisit it. So we're now got a new working group that just started. You can see from the Zoom meeting at the bottom there that we started on Monday. So this is a new working group that will look at underwater noise, chaired by Frank Thompson and co-chaired by Sonia Mendes. And we'll update that first document, but it'll be broadened from marine mammals to including all marine organisms, looking at the current knowledge and research gaps and highlighting any conflicts that exists. So that's kind of looking to the future already. So just finally then, some of the things that we've done lately and looking more towards the future, working on sustainable development goals. The 6th Marine Board Forum in 2017 was specifically on implementing the UN 2030 agenda and what role marine science would play in that. And that basically led to, once we were starting to look at what our next Navigate the Future document was going to be about, was basically on the marine science that we need for a sustainable future. So again, working on sustainable development goals, which we launched last year at the Eurasian meeting in 2019 in Paris, and came up with a policy brief where we basically specifically mapped the recommendations from the Navigate Future 5 onto the Ocean Decade. So if you look at, if you go and download the NF5 document, Navigate Future 5 document, you'll see that there's 5 substantive chapters. The first one is basically the 4-dimensional ocean, so the 3-dimensional ocean and how it changes over time. There's one on the impact of multiple stressors, cumulative multiple stressors. How do we predict extreme events and natural hazards under climate change? What is the advances that we need in ocean technologies, modeling and under artificial intelligence, and looking at sustainability science, which is a new, well, maybe not so new, but something that we really need to do in the marine science field. So when we map those chapters and recommendations of those chapters onto the societal outcomes of the decade, you can see that there was quite a lot of overlap between a clean ocean, sustainably harvested, safe ocean, healthy ocean, predicted ocean, and transparent ocean. There was a lot of overlap with all of the recommendations. So that's basically where we are now. So looking into the future, so this is my last couple of slides. So from the very first document in 1995, there's some things that we haven't really addressed, and not in Europe or not in the Marine Board, but also I think not really in Europe. The first one I think is coastal zones, and basically we've just created a new working group. Well, we've just announced a new working group on coastal resilience, for which we are just getting sign off for the terms of reference, and we'll call for members sometime next week, I suspect. So that's one thing where we'll be taking that up still. And then I think the operational forecasting and of the oceans and coastal seas, we're still not there. We're not really doing forecasting yet. Some of the other documents have called for this: integrated policy evaluation tools, expanding predictive modeling, and also facilitating marine spatial planning, which is kind of the follow-on from that. Also, Navigate Future 5 calls for a virtual ocean, and first of all, I'll say that the links to provisioning of goods and services that was called for in the ecosystem approach and that led to the valuing marine ecosystems, as I said, the EU Blue Economy Report 2020, which you see in the bottom right there, is the report that just came out today, and we were delighted to see that they actually took our recommendations in there as part of the recommendations that's needed. So that's great to know. The virtual ocean is also quite interesting because we've just seen that the European Commission has put a call out to strengthen our knowledge in support of the European Green Deal. And under topic 3, there's a specific call on a transparent and accessible ocean towards a digital twin of the ocean. So I think it feels like we're all pushing in the same direction, and being able to get that data out there and making sure that people can use this virtual ocean, this digital twin ocean, to manage properly, I think is the way forward. Then also some other things that I think are that where we're going in the future. From the European research area, the enhanced public awareness, the marine archaeology paper asks for communicating science results to the public. So, and I think for that, the Marine Board's communication panel is actually busy working on a science brief on future science brief on marine science communication in Europe. So I think that will probably come out next year. So that's something to look forward to. But also, I think the Seas, Oceans and Public Health in Europe project is a good way to make sure people understand how important the oceans are. The EU for Ocean project is also really important, and also pushing for people to understand the importance of marine research. And then I think the mission on healthy oceans, seas, coasts and inland waters, the new EU Commission mission, I think will really facilitate understanding of public awareness. That's precisely what that mission is about. Then finally, the cross-disciplinary research and collaboration called for under the Deep Sea, and the sustainability science that's called for under Navigate Future 5. I think that the mission will definitely work towards that. That's one of the things that the mission is planning to do. But also, I think the UN Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development will for sure enhance those sort of newer ways of doing things, breaking out of our silos. So with that, I will just say thank you very much. There's just an overview of some of the publications. I couldn't fit them all on, but these are most of the ones that I talked about. And if you're interested in any of our publications, then you can go to the website at the top there. Thank you.
Sheila, thank you so much for that. It's I think everybody can see how much work the EMB has been doing over an extended period of time. And boy, oh boy, you can see why the review panel was so complimentary. So we have a few questions. We only have a few minutes left.
Yeah, sorry, I went on a bit.
But I'd like to try and get through. That's okay. So we'll start with Isabel Souza Pinto. Hello, Isabel. And she asks, regarding marine biodiversity, what do you think should be the next steps for the EMB? And I would ask Sheila if you could just give a really crisp answer so we can get to more of the questions. Thanks.
What would be the next thing? I think it's probably something that will come out maybe in the coastal resilience. I suspect it will be important to come into that. But for the Marine Board, you know, we can talk along about how these things happen, and so I think it's something that we'll just keep on pushing. So we will keep on pushing it from the Marine Board side. But I don't think that we have a specific document planned from a Marine Board side yet.
Great, thank you. And we have a couple of questions from Miguel Santos. He wants to know more about the EMB. Do you have national delegates or contact points? And because he wasn't aware of all this, and wants to know how they can become involved in EMB activities.
So Miguel, I'm not sure where you're from, but if you're from one of the countries in Europe, then I would go to the people that are, you can go on our website and see who our members are. So you can contact the people that are on the website for your country. If you're not from a country in Europe, then I'm afraid, other than listening to our webinars, there's not much we can do, but we are always happy to participate and help wherever we can, especially with the regional Atlantic partnerships and things like that. If you're from a country in Europe, but we don't have you don't have a member, then contact us and we can always try and see if you can become a member of the Marine Board. So, yeah.
That was one of my questions too, whether you'd accept observers from other than European countries, but we can talk about that another time. I apologize in advance if I butcher pronunciations of names, but the next question is from Isa Elegbede. Is there any collaboration between the European Science Foundation and other science entities in other continents such as Africa, South America, and Asia? And if any, what are the successes?
To be honest,
do you know that one?
Yeah, so I think the European Science Foundation has changed over time, and I'm not sure if there's any collaboration between them and other countries. I do know that the European Commission has done quite a lot, DGRTD specifically, to have collaboration. So there's these collaborative projects like Anchor and the other one, so under the Belém Statement and under the Galway Statement, there are collaborations between, especially in Africa, especially in the Atlantic, between the countries around the Atlantic. So if you're interested in that kind of collaboration, if you send me an email, I can always send you details on that. Yeah.
Okay, so Jerry Miller has a question. Jerry, it took you a couple of times to get your question in there, but that's fine, and welcome. Jerry says, can you characterize for us the international collaborations involving scientists and policymakers from outside of Europe? That is, to what extent have members of the North American, African, and/or South American communities been engaged?
Well, in the Marine Board, other than when we have these kind of combined working groups like we did with ICES, for instance, because there's people in ICES that are not just from Europe. The Marine Board as such don't usually interact in this way, but I think there are ways of interacting, as I said, through these larger collaborative projects that might happen. And I don't know, now I've lost the question. But yeah, I think at least at the Commission level, they've definitely been pushing for more collaboration outward of Europe with their Horizon Europe and Horizon 2020 projects. So in that case, there has been those collaborations, yes. And then I guess from a marine perspective, there are networks like POGO, which is much more international than the Marine Board. So there are other networks that work at that level.
Right. Although POGO is focused on observations, of course. Okay, Niall, welcome. As Sheila has said, says, hi Sheila, great presentation. As a scientist who's moved to work at the Science Policy Interface, what is your view on the effectiveness of this interface? Is the voice of the scientific community being heard by funders, policymakers, and vice versa? And can the scientific community do better in influencing the research agenda? I can answer the last part is yes, but Sheila?
I think it's actually, it's great. I think there's more, there is more connections than I thought before I started, but it's also harder than I thought it was. It's not just that you can speak to them and then it's going to happen. It's, as I mentioned, some of this is a very long-term strategy. So if you think that it's important, it might take 20 years for them to realize how important it is. So, and sometimes I think it always depends on if you just happen to be at the right time at the right place, or if something that you mentioned that you think is important just happens to also be important to other people. So I think it's actually, I'm not being very, very eloquent with my answer, but I think that it's interesting to see how the beast operates. That is the funding agencies. And that's true for any funding agency, actually. The closer you get, the more you understand the intricacies and idiosyncrasies of them. And I think, what can scientists do? I think scientists can engage more. Being a part of the working groups that we have is a really good way to get to speak to politicians, and learning how to speak politician instead of speaking science. So I think that would be the easiest way to get involved, I think. And in some countries, I know you can actually do some placements at a policy institute or something. So I think that if you're interested, that's what I would suggest for scientists to do.
Great, thanks, Sheila. And Anna Naronya, of course, has said they're planning a communication course in the framework of Anchor and would like to be put in contact with the communication working group.
Yeah, we can totally do that.
Okay, we're kind of wrapping up here. There are some questions that haven't been answered, which I think you can answer later, but I would like to go to the one from Milton Campbell that says, with the pandemic of COVID-19, much attention has been given to scientific issues in public health. How do you see future developments in this area of health or diseases associated with, I will stick it, he says water, I say with the ocean.
I actually think that, well, there's two things. There is the diseases that are linked to the ocean. So, HABs, harmful algal blooms, for instance, that's something that's in the ocean sphere. But also the medicines that come from the ocean. There was an article by the Woods Hole about the fact that the way they're testing for COVID is something that came from research that was done on sponges or came from work that came out of sponges, marine sponges. Right. So I think there's a lot of links that we should make, and we should make people aware that there's links between oceans and human health that people should be aware of. But I think the most interesting link is the human health, health and well-being link, because anybody who's been stuck indoors for 3 months under COVID knows that going out into nature really helps. Going for a walk if you can, even looking at pictures of pretty beaches makes a difference to your mental health. So I think there's going to be a lot of push to make sure that people take up this health that you can get from blue and green spaces. So
right, yeah, I think there's a lot more attention being paid now to I guess cures and pharmaceuticals from the ocean vis-a-vis COVID. So I think we'll see a lot more of that. Yeah, I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our time. Yeah, Cesar Martinez, Sheila has your question, and I'm sure she can. It wasn't answered earlier, and I'm sorry you had problems with your computer, but I'm sure she will answer you on that one. I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you to Sheila, of course, and a special thanks to Jose Luis Moutinho, who invited us both to be here and who really looked after the session today. He's hiding behind the Air Center logo, but that's okay. I will say that the Networking Fridays will continue next week, June 19th, from 1 to 2 p.m. UTC. The presenter is Suleiman Omeza Eku Sadiku, with the moderator Asma Ibrahim, and the topic will be towards a blue economy for sustainable development, the case of Nigeria, so please join us. And the following week it will be a panel, so it will be a two-hour session, and that session will explore some of the technologies emerging to fill gaps on sensor technologies, with an emphasis on sensors for biodiversity and aquaculture. If you have suggestions for improvement today, please send those to Jose Luis. You have his email address on the invitation, or you can leave comments on the chat. I would say the email might be better. But again, thank you. It's been a real treat. And Sheila, really, again, nice to hear everything the EMB is doing. I think it is a model for other countries and around the world. And so thank you. And I wish everybody a very safe and happy and healthy weekend.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.